Okay, we're going to another episode of On the Wrist from Off the Cuff to have a really cool comparison for you guys from the brands Seiko and Zodiac. A little bit about them. Seiko was founded back in 1881. They're Japanese in origin, now factories throughout Asia. They cover all market segments from entry level to high end, while Zodiac was established in 1882, and they're a Swiss-made heritage revival brand that is now part of the Fossil Group, which is run out of the US. Now, in terms of these two particular GMTs, we have on the left the Prospex Landmaster GMT SPB411 Navigator Timer Reissue, and on the right we have the Super Seawolf GMT World Time ZO9409. And the Seiko is a faithful recreation of the 1968 Seiko 6117-8000, the brand's first GMT style watch with a rotating bezel, while the Zodiac recalls directly from their vintage 1970s Super Seawolf models, but modernized and sized up to a 40mm from the original 36mm. In terms of the pricing, the Seiko goes for $1,500 MSRP. I sourced mine locally via Belmont Watches, here located in San Diego. And in terms of the Zodiac, it actually retails for $1,795. What I find very interesting is how comparable these two watches are, yet I feel like the reaction in terms of the price point evaluation seems to be pretty widespread. So I feel like I definitely heard a lot of commentary about this particular Seiko being overpriced, while this Zodiac that is about $300 more is pretty much often just kind of accepted at that price point. So I find that interesting, so I figured why not turn that into a little segment where we could discuss openly here in this video, as well as of course down in the comments below. So big shout out to Belmont Watches, of course, for sponsoring this particular segment. So before we pick these pieces up, let's go ahead and hear a word about Belmont.
They say you don't just buy the product, you buy the seller too. Well, here's a seller I can absolutely recommend. Belmont Watches in San Diego. They deal in both new and pre-owned, from industry mainstays to niche independents, across vintage and modern references. I've personally purchased watches from them and even had watches serviced and repaired through the local network. Whether you're just browsing current inventory or searching for a special reference, reach out and connect. You never know, they might be able to source the exact model you've been looking for. They drop new models every Thursday and even offer free 2-day shipping on all orders. Check out this amazing one-owner find, a true piece of history equipped with genuine one-off memorabilia personal to the Royal Canadian Air Force pilot who wore it proudly for so many years. You just can't find packages like this via standard retail. It takes real-world industry experience to create an offering like this. And if you're ever local, visiting downtown San Diego, you can check out their selection in person or just stop by and talk shop with some fellow enthusiasts who also happen to be some of the most down-to-earth and knowledgeable guys in the industry. So before your next big purchase, make sure to check out Belmont Watches and tell them Mark sent you. Thanks, guys.
All right, and we're back. So these two pieces, of course, at face value, both retro vintage inspired pieces from brands that do have a lot of history, but of course their brand trajectories have been very different, where Seiko has pretty much been in continuous production and remained independent, while Zodiac has been a brand, although has a great historical background, especially within the horological space, unfortunately, fell on some hard times. Their brand has been owned by other brands, at one point even owned by Tag Heuer, and most recently now, licensed out the name to these to the Fossil Group. So both of these pieces are really nice, and of course I own them both, and they both do take a very restrained take unique in terms of the GMT hand, which, you know, a lot of modern GMTs today can really focus on that big hand, and often it can even overpower your local hour hand. Here you're going to see it's just nicely complemented with just a, you know, a little bit of pop of color there against a beautiful gray sunray backdrop. The main difference going to be one, of course, has a 24-hour scale versus the other having the text showing the world time index. Now, in terms of dimensions, you got 38.5 versus 40, and that's for the diameter. Then in terms of thickness, you got 12.8 versus 13.3, and then in terms of lug to lug, you're going to have 45.2 versus 47.6. So slightly larger all the way around. Both of them are going to be constructed out of stainless steel. You're going to have one that has Seiko's proprietary Dia Shield super hard coating versus uncoated. That's going to have, you know, different drawbacks. Hey, yes, you are going to be able to have scratch resistance additionally, but here you're going to, if you do get scratches, you can refinish easier because there's no coating. So, you know, that can be a bit of a wash. It is really based on preference. Both bezels are are both bidirectional, but one has a 24-hour index here, and the other, again, has that world time index, but it actually has 24 clicks. So this is going to be smooth spinning here, as you can see. No stops. And the other is going to be a very appropriate bidirectional 24 click. So very nice, and, you know, depending on what you prefer, I do enjoy a good click. Would have been nice to have this with a 48 click, but I can understand, you know, with the thinness and the execution, why it is kind of what it is. They both feature brushing and polishing there, so multi-finished solid links and end links, but here you're going to have a quick release end link there with the quick release spring bars, and here you're going to have more traditional spring bars, all solid. Here there's going to be shorter links, so you're going to get a little bit more articulation. Here you're going to have longer links. Here you're going to have more of a deployant style clasp opening, while here you're going to have more of a traditional milled clasp flip lock style. Of course, you're going to get a little bit more adjustment out of this milled buckle. Here you're going to have less adjustment, but because you have shorter links, it's still going to be equally as easy to put on. And they're both going to have solid case backs hiding those movements. Both of the movements here are collar style GMTs. We have one for the Seiko, which is the 6R54, and that has a 72-hour 3-day power reserve and beats at 3 hertz or 21,600 vibrations per hour in terms of the beat rate. Versus here, you're going to have your Swiss automatic Soprod C125 collar GMT, which has a 42-hour power reserve and beats at 4 hertz or 28,800 vibrations per hour in terms of the beat rate. So smoother sweep here versus longer power reserve. So you're getting basically an extra day of power reserve, a little bit over an extra day, because this is short of a 2-day power reserve at just 42. But again, those things can trade off. But one thing in terms of value that it's, you know, a little harder to argue is you have a fully in-house movement versus here, although Fossil does own STP, this is not an STP movement, so you couldn't really consider it in-house or in group because this movement is from Soprod. So, but it is Swiss made, and we all know that, of course, for Swiss made, for that badge to be on the dial, that means 60% of the value has to come from Switzerland. That also means that the movement has to be Swiss and the final assembly needs to be done in Switzerland. So if that is something that you value, then that's also something that you would be able to, you know, can calculate into the value here, versus being in-house. That is one thing where, you know, it's in terms of quality assurance, quality control, all coming underneath the same house. But some people might not like that because they might not be thrilled with the quality control that they've seen from certain Seikos. While I would say the nice thing is, from a marketing perspective, Zodiac stays clearly within a lane of around $1,000 and up, whereas Seiko has watches that are, you know, anywhere from $100 to multiples of thousands if you're counting Grand Seiko or Creedor, I should say. I don't want to go full accent on that in terms of some of their other offerings, whether it be Prospex LX, Presage, King Seiko, Seiko 5. So there's just a wide range. This is within the Prospex line, but it doesn't have any Prospex badging, although it does have a Prospex hang tag and packaging in terms of, well, limited edition packaging. Both of these are listed as limited editions. One is numbered limited edition here. This one is an unnumbered limited edition. And honestly, it might have been so popular they decided to put it into regular production because, as far as I can tell, sometimes it's listed as limited edition, sometimes it is not. So I thought that was very interesting. But you guys can see in terms of the aesthetic, very similar in terms of their colorways. Very nice, very versatile, and very handsome, and of course both nodding to their respective pasts there. Very different in terms of the architecture. In terms of that case, you're going to see very smooth, organic, free-flowing lines here in terms of this kind of cushion style case from the Seiko, whereas here you're going to have something that's going to be a bit more industrial, where the lugs shapes are feeling very separate from the case, compartmentalizing a lot of that visual heft in a different way, versus here flowing with a lot of undercuts, rounded edges, and whatnot. You're going to have 100 meters of water resistance through a push-pull crown, but that push-pull crown is nicely recessed, so you're not going to have to worry too much about that accidentally pulling out. Here you're getting a screw-down crown and 200 meters of water resistance, so there's that trade-off as well. But of course, the thickness versus thinness will also come into play in terms of 100 versus 200 meters of water resistance. I really like both of these watches. I think they're very comparable. I do appreciate the fact that they are collar style GMTs. I know right now all the rage is for traveler style GMTs, and that is really fantastic for those watches. I own a few of them. My most expensive one being my Grand Seiko GMT. It does have the local jumping hour complication to it, being a true or flyer style GMT or traveler's GMT, which is very intuitive for travel, but a lot like dive watches, you're not always going to be underwater, and with travel watches or GMT watches, you're not always going to be traveling. So that's where the trade-off is. So having that local jumping hour also disables the ability to have a quick set date, where with a traditional collar style GMT, that's the nice thing, is that you do have that quick set date option to where you can cycle through. So if you haven't worn the watch for a long time, you pick it up, you can just normally cycle through the date versus having to go around 24 hours essentially to get back and forward through the date. So I mean, potentially you could be doing that for about up to 15 day span, going backwards or forwards with a traveler style GMT, versus here you're going to be able to just roll right through it like you would normally with a 3-hand watch, which I think is pretty nice. Of course, the use case is going to mainly be to keep that 24-hour hand, typically just referencing the 24-hour scales, like you're going to see it here, 10 p.m., or I should say 10 a.m., and then 10 a.m. or 1000, on the 24-hour scale. So very nice, very clean, very easy to read. And then if you wanted to jump it to get East Coast time, I'm here in the West Coast, I would jump it 3 hours, or however far I needed to jump it. And then if I want to do a quick calculation for an extra time zone, then I could of course rotate the bezel as well, where here you're going to be able to have that whole index, so you can go ahead and rotate through any one of those times, which is a nice quick reference if you are traveling, or let's say you just have multiple meetings and you need to make a call to somebody in the East Coast, somebody in Australia, somebody in Japan. You're going to have some quick references here, which I think is really great. So although this isn't a full review, if you guys are looking for the full reviews, they both exist on the channel already. So with that said, let's actually get these pieces on wrist and see how they wear. All right, guys, as you can see on my 7.5-inch wrist, this piece wears fantastic. Of course, if I get it a bit too close to the lens, you're going to get some perspective distortion and it's going to feel just a little bit larger than it actually is. Even though I do have a larger 7.5-inch wrist, you can see that it's quite tall, which means it's a rounder wrist. So it's not just flat and wide to accommodate to every single watch. So I still had to be conscious in terms of how watches wear on my wrist. Then in terms of the Seiko, very nice. You can see, of course, without the contrast of the black bezel insert, though, by having that in steel, it definitely makes the more compact size feel just a little bit more organic, versus if it did have let's say a black bezel, I think it might wear or visually a little bit small. But of course, on wrist, this thing just flows and it's very, very handsome. And I'm just really, really enjoying that. But, you know, what we'll do is we can just tighten up the frame here so you guys can still get a detailed look. And you can see now it looks a lot more centered on my wrist, because now that perspective, it looks just a little bit truer to the eye versus to the camera lens. Here we go for the Zodiac, also very nice. I like the shoulders on these lugs. I like the beveled edges there. Very clean, very classic. You can see the multi-finished and faceted handset and dial furniture. Really, really classic. It does have slightly larger font, but I think the font and the branding and everything like that and the model, it all flows and it is in the right scale, because if it was smaller, it might feel a little bit busier. Somehow with a larger scale, it just makes it feel just a touch more balanced. Versus here with the Seiko, slightly more subdued, of course, smaller typeface, smaller branding, and you do get an applied logo, also applied indices, multi-finished and faceted. Also, you do have little spots of lume. Same here, of course, you get a little bit of lume there as well. But, you know, overall, just a bit of a different aesthetic and a different look, although the colorways are very similar and, you know, equally, I would say, versatile, right? Which is nice because it's a steel watch. Your dial has that steely kind of gray hue to it, more of a kind of gunmetal and anthracite, which does add a little bit of depth, a little bit of contrast, but not so much to where it's making the dial feel oversized, which I really like. I think that does help with the vintage aesthetic to keep the dial space a little bit smaller and spreading out all the information and text and numerals in a way that is going to really help the dial breathe, especially when it's carrying a lot of different information. So with that said, let's actually get these pieces off the wrist, set up for some lume shots, low light transition, and closing thoughts. Okay, let's go ahead and hit the lights here. As you can see, while these do have, you know, diver-like silhouettes, they definitely don't have diver-like lume with those minimal lume plots. The nice thing is you're still going to have it be quite legible. Neither of them really have do a great job of keeping that cardinal reference in terms of 12 o'clock, at least in pitch black. Of course, though, you're not always going to be in a pitch black environment, just like you're not always going to be out in the middle of a field enjoying direct sunlight in a perfectly well lit environment. So one thing I always like to work in is a bit of a low light transition so that you can see what these colors, textures, and finishes render like in less than optimal lighting. So check that out. You can see there's a lot of different play, and, you know, maybe even get into some harsh lighting here where you guys can typically see any types of production defects being exposed, but you're just going to maybe see a little wear and tear apart for some really nice brushing and casework there. Of course, these aren't meant to be luxury timepieces, but they are finished to a very high standard for a sports or tool watch. Very nice. You can see that their dials do play with the light in a very similar way, whereas I'd say the Seiko has maybe slightly cooler tone to the gray, whereas you have a slightly warmer tone to the gray on the Zodiac, and that might even just be due to the way that the pieces are contrasting off of them. Ooh, and I'm also noticing that there's a bit of some smudging I can see now on the sapphire crystal. That's one thing I'm not sure I pointed out, that they both have beautiful box dome sapphire crystals that are very, very legible, very handsome. In terms of the bezel inserts, one has a K1 mineral insert, being the Zodiac, while the Seiko has a stainless steel brushed insert. Both of them look very nice, and they do the job for their perspective, use case. One being more of a 24-hour scale traditional, and the other being, again, that world time scale with those reference points. So very, very nice, guys. I'm a fan of both of these watches. And it was funny, I didn't really occur to me that they were so comparable until just very recently. I was just looking through, a couple of different watch rolls where I keep all of my stuff, and I was like, wow, these are actually pretty comparable. They're similar in terms of even the brand's original founding dates: 1881, 1882, 1968 watch versus watch from the 1970s. The little matchstick versus the small arrow, GMT hand against that beautiful sunray gray dial. Really well finished handsets and applied indices. So there's a lot there. And then you even do get date windows at 3 o'clock. So as different as they are also very alike. And in terms of value proposition, I always think that is just a little, again, an interesting topic. So feel free to chime in with your thoughts below, because I definitely have had folks tell me that they believe that, this Seiko is overpriced. And I mean, by all accounts, it is more in-house. It has a longer power reserve. And some of you might be saying, hey, well, that, the shorter power reserve is fine with that smoother hertz beat rate. That's a fair argument. But I will say, let's say the Swatch Group, they've turned down the beat rate on pretty much all of their nicer watches with their Powermatic movements to extend their power reserves at the cost of a slightly slower beat rate, sometimes 3 hertz, sometimes 3.5 hertz. And that's in their luxury side where they go 3.5. I'm talking certain Longines models, and of course everything from Omega. Those aren't typically, I should say everything, but most watches in Omega's lineup are going to be only 3.5 hertz versus full 4 hertz. So it's definitely something to consider. One, of course, is Swiss made, one is made in Japan, but one is organically Asian made, and the other is, I would say, I'm sure has a lot of Asian components, but it's just not, as much within the lore or the glamour of the watches themselves. Because, hey, if it's going to be 40% Swiss, that means it's, 60% value-wise Swiss. I mean, that means at least 40% is going to be made elsewhere. And I'm sure if they're going to make it elsewhere, it's probably going to be in Asia. So that's definitely something to consider. And yeah, I think it's a very interesting talking point, and I'm really curious to hear your guys' stance on that. So, closing thoughts from me, I was really surprised to see how similar these two watches were, both their original vintage inspirations as well as their modern recreations. I do find it super interesting how common it is to see folks proclaiming this particular Seiko as overpriced when this Zodiac, so closely comparable, is almost $300 more, and it gets very little pushback in terms of the price point. And I'm sure a lot of that has to do with this is well within Zodiac's normal price point versus Seiko. Not a lot of folks who, especially if you're just getting into Seiko recently, you probably got into their stuff and it was, the SARB or the SKX, watches that have been around 15, 20 years that have been overstocked, and you're getting well below their actual retail price. And a lot of people had their kind of ideas of Seiko's value proposition skewed by a small handful of JDM gems and just highly desirable and collectible pieces, when there have been very expensive Seikos for many, many years. There's watches that Seiko's charging $4,000 for back in the 90s. So definitely something to think about, and of course perspective is very huge within this conversation. So let me know what you all think down in the comments below. If you like the video, please do it like, and if you're not already, please subscribe for more content just like this. Thanks, guys.